Alrighty, welcome back. I hope, like me, you're half excited and half depressed about what you just heard. What I'd like to do in the next 2 hours is to cover sort of something that I think was latent also in the talk you just heard by Russ Poldrack, which has to do with what are your questions and what can fMRI do to help us resolve questions, be them purely biological versus sort of cognitive in nature. The material I'm going to present now, which relates to experimental design, it was really split into halves. The first half is really about how do we ask questions and what kind of designs do you use, what are the problems and the typical pitfalls of certain designs. And the second half will be sort of how do we actually implement this when we're actually there and trying, once we have our task down and we really want to turn this into a sequence of events inside an MRI machine. Okay. So I will start with this really great quote, and I hate when quotes just sort of appear. I'll read it because it's the heart of the problem that we're going to discuss for the next 2 hours and that you should bring away with you. Attending a poster session at a recent meeting, I was reminding of that old adage, to the man who has only a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And the point is that this is exactly how the author feels, and a lot of people feel about fMRI. Many of the studies summarized in these posters did not seem to be designed to answer a specific question about how the brain functions. Neither did they seem to bear on specific questions about the role of particular brain regions. Really, the processes and the biology, right? The location and the processes that might be embedded in certain locations of the brain. Rather, they could best be described as exploratory. People were asked to engage in some task, and then you explore what comes out of it. You look at what lights up when people do task X, right? This really summarizes. And this is a very profound quote. It was 1999. We still struggle with the same problem. Some of you might have read, there's a series of papers. Russ Poldrack was involved in this series of papers concerning what exactly have we learned about how the human mind works from fMRI. Have we even learned anything, right? Which is one of the points that was being driven in the previous talk. And this, of course, relates to how you're approaching MRI, relates to what are you going to do with it, right? What are your questions? How are you going to transform them from questions to actual sequences of events and button presses and stimuli displayed on a screen, et cetera, et cetera. So what are reasonable questions? Well, it kind of depends on perhaps what department you sit in, what are your interests, and that sort of stuff. One perfectly legal question is charting the territory, right? Sort of the purely like the more neuroscience end of this, the more biological end of this. How does a particular, what does a particular part of the brain do? I mean, perfectly legal. How does a certain part of the brain compute or represent whatever information it is sensitive to? Or how specific is a certain region for a specific kind of processes or information? So is it specific to a certain content? Is it sort of more domain general? Very important questions. Here, one example that I have often worked on. Do the routines of language allow you to understand organized structure outside of domains that we call language, right? Who knows? Math, arithmetic, right? Do you need language to understand the structured hierarchy of arithmetic statements, right? Perfectly legal question, at least I think so. Maybe the biological, so the charting the territory side, but if you're in a psychology department or you're interested in those sorts of questions, a perfectly legal question is just sort of trying to understand what are the processes and representations and how do they map, right, on brain events. And in particular, the real question you're asking is, can I learn something from putting someone in a very expensive, extremely loud device that can inform that can inform cognitive psychology more than I could just gain from having someone press a button or something of that sort without having to look inside the brain. And a lot of the controversy, if you've read it, really has to do with this latter point. Have we learned anything from looking at brains that we couldn't have somehow learned from just getting people to press buttons or generate verbs or something of that sort. Of course, it might be very interesting to relating things to external variables. For example, how do patterns of brain activation relate to differences across subjects, right? Maybe genetics, or maybe skills, or maybe sort of individual variability. Then, of course, very interesting questions about not just how individual brain regions work and how they process information, what kind of information, how strictly they process that kind of information, but how do multiple regions come together to generate certain things. Right? Maybe some parts of, very likely, most parts of human cognition are rarely encapsulated exclusively in one part. I mean, some parts of the brain, you will know, are necessary for certain aspects of cognition, but they usually do not work in isolation, right? And a lot of people focus on this. If you've done any graph theoretic analysis or this, that's exactly the kind of thing that you're looking at. And I'll leave any more detail to sort of the lectures that will happen down the line. Some less great questions to ask are, what lights up when people do task X? Right? And if you've ever tried to apply to the James S. McDonald Foundation for funding, they specifically say, we do not fund fMRI research that asks what lights up when people do X. Right? And the fact that a funding agency that is interested in how the brain works, and their job is to find, next to you, to fund you because you're asking an interesting question, and fMRI is one of the many tools that they agree is part of the neuroscience sort of set of tools. They specifically say this: if that's what you're asking, we don't care. There's a good reason why they don't care. Yeah? Or maybe this is sort of something that people have done in the past. How do two groups differ on a certain process when that process is the way in which you've selected the two groups? For example, high proficiency reader, low proficiency reading. How do they differ on reading? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? You've selected them on the basis of something. It's not that interesting to know that good readers and bad readers differ on reading, on a reading task. You already knew that to begin with, right? Not interesting. So really, right, the point I'm trying to drive is that we really want to design experiments that really leverage on what brain imaging can do for us, right? Not just in an exploratory way. And I think people have caught up in the last few years with this, and people are developing more sophisticated questions. And certain approaches, multivariate pattern analysis might be one of them, right? Can allow us to ask sort of more questions than just where something is happening, but sort of what kind of information is happening in there, right? Which is another very interesting question, particularly if you care about sort of the cognitive processes that might be embodied in certain parts of the brain. Now, I do have to make sort of a little premise. And when you think about experimental design, there really are two aspects that you want to keep clearly separated, and that both of which enter in an fMRI experiment. One is the conceptual design. This is really, what is the process or biological sort of question that you're having, right? So, and this kind of question, this level of questioning, it's no different than any other cognitive psychology reaction time study or any study from other fields of biology, right? So all the problems that have to do with creating a conceptual design, what is the question you're asking, what kind of processes you're trying to get at, these, you've got the same problems that any other field, any other experimental field has. But to us, instead, and I will probably be focusing more on this latter aspect, there's a methodological design issue. And this really relates to how do we turn your biological process-oriented question into an fMRI experiment? How do you map cognitive processes or information, if you will, onto blood flow response, right? How do you do that mapping? And a lot of what happens here and how you do go from your conceptual question to an actual implementation of it, well, a lot of the issues that arise here are tool specific. So we have to contend with all the limitations, all the boundaries, all the idiosyncrasies of the certain tool we're using, no different than any other tool-based approach. Right? There are certain idiosyncrasies, there are certain features of the tool that we have to keep in mind as we go from our sort of big picture theoretical conceptual question into an actual experimental design. Now, the very basis of how we typically approach the methodological level in fMRI is the subtraction method, and I'm pretty sure you should be all very familiar with. And the idea is fairly simple. You acquire data under two conditions. These conditions supposedly only differ in one thing: the cognitive process you're interested in. So you compare brain response during condition A, where there is this process. You compare that to brain response to condition B, where everything else is the same bar that one process. Subtract, and magically the one thing that appears, right, that remains is that one process you cared about. And here's one of the sort of earliest illustrations of this. This might have actually been PET. I'm not sure. But you get a stimulation condition, you get a control condition, subtract, take the result for subject 1, do the same for subject 2, subject 3, subject 4, subject 5, average that, and boom, that's your group analysis. And by the time you get to your group analysis, oh, look, this was a visual experiment. Yeah? Fairly simple, straightforward. Now, this sounds so straightforward that we shouldn't even be thinking or talking about it. Yet, if you look at the literature, it turns out it's not all that straightforward. And there are a number of reasons why. But take a token experiment. I just literally made up the least interesting experiment. Well, not the least interesting, but I just made it up sort of for this. Say that what you want to know about is the neurocognitive processes that have to do with word repetition, right? In fact, sorry, when I said least interesting, I should not have said that. I'm sure people study this all the time. It's like, let me come up with something. I take it back. I'm so sorry. If you're listening and you do this, I'm sorry. Keep in mind I wasn't sleeping last night. The chat thing, yeah, of course. Now I've gone viral, and I'll be shunned from the world of neuroscience. So this might be your conceptual question, right? And let's just say that you're turning it into a certain specific task, which might just happen to be you're presented with a word on a screen and you repeat that, right? So that's how you're embodying your question. So here's how the experiment goes. You show something on a screen, and your subject sees it and repeats it. And this just happens to activate some parts of the brain, quasi-randomly depicted here in the shaded area. But then, of course, when you look at this, it's not specific enough, right? So we want the baseline that has all the properties of our task of interest, bar the repetition. Yep. So what we're going to do is we're going to use as a baseline task just pure reading, silent reading, no repetition involved. And if all goes well, this should elicit some areas that are that have to do with the reading part, but that do not touch a repetition. You subtract the two, and you're left with some piece of the brain that, putatively, is really, that is what repetition, that's really special part of your brain for repetition, all right? Fairly simple, straightforward, exactly what you saw on the previous slide. Now, how many ways can this go wrong? So many. And if you've read the literature, you've probably seen a gazillion of these. In fact, who knows, my own papers might have some of these, but I won't tell you. For example, right, in how many ways can the baseline be problematic when you do this kind of thing? Well, how about if articulatory processes are just automatic? What if by the act of seeing whatever is being shown on the screen, you're automatically kind of triggering, just not carrying out, right, the articulation process? Then who knows, maybe what could happen is that your baseline now is actually activating, at least in part, if not entirely, those processes that you were interested in. You subtract them, nothing is left. And there you go. Oh, geez, there's nothing in the brain couldn't care less about repeating out loud. Right? Could be. Or alternatively, what if your subjects get bored? Reading, I don't have to do anything. I just look at a screen, I read. I could be thinking about, my girlfriend, yesterday's movie. I don't know, I could be thinking whatever I want. What you'd have is this. Now, there's nothing special happening about reading because your subject is actually not engaging in the task. And what you're left with is a lot more activation than you're supposed to have, right? So, and this clearly goes to show how dependent anything you read in the literature is upon the choice of task. And sort of if you're listening at the end of Russ's talk, that's exactly the point I was trying to drive, right? Not all results are created equal. And typically the reason why they're not created equal, it's because they depend in task-based approaches so deeply on how you choose your task and your control task. And now this seems like nobody would make a mistake like that. I mean, who would ever do a mistake like this? except it does happen. There's an anonymous paper that was interested in logic inference, and what they did is a number of different logic inferences, and their control, the subtraction, sort of the baseline, was rest periods. And then they have a number of regions were more active in the inferences versus the control baseline. You get all sorts of stuff: parietal, temporal, languagey kind regions, frontal regions. And you look at this, and the problem is that you don't know which of these, if any, has anything to do with reasoning. They could have to do with reading, working memory. You have no idea. Right? Semantic processing, you have no idea. You have no idea to tell which of these areas that are depicted on, that are reported on the table have anything to do with your process of interest. In a sense, not very interesting. The most you can say is some subset of these areas might have to do with reasoning itself, right? As opposed to reading and keeping information in memory, manipulating stuff in non-deductive ways, et cetera, et cetera. So this does happen, and it happens all the time. If you review papers, you probably see this all the time. Now, there are a number of very common confounds, I tried to have a bit of a list on here. For one, very typical, attention might be required, or sort of the task difficulty is different in your task of interest versus your comparison task, right? And now you have sort of an additional confound, just like cognitive sweat, in a sense, right? As opposed to your task of interest, or rather your result, the result of the subtraction is now whatever areas are elicited by the difference in the cognitive processes plus whatever areas are important for, cognitive sweat, as I said. You need to keep under control which processes are involved in task and control. You might want to have a very strong basis for saying, well, my task is eliciting exactly as that table did in 1997 that you saw in the previous talk, right? These are the processes that are going on in my task, and these are the processes going on in my baseline, right? You need to have a good grip on that. As I sort of pointed out in the previous animation, over-controlling the control task might be a problem. What if you subtract out too much? And you're now subtracting out part of the processes you're interested in, right? And at this point, you can start thinking about your own domain and start coming up with baseline tasks and thinking, is that baseline task a good task? Here's an example. This comes from Susan Buchheimer. Nonsense speech. Is that good? Is that a good baseline for real speech? I mean, it does have you're listening to sounds, just the sounds don't quite map onto anything that you know of, and so you don't trigger all those, for example, semantic processes, right? However, we do have a spontaneous tendency to interpret speech, so maybe as something comes in and it's an odd signal, you might be paying way more attention to that than the actual speech stimulus. You might be trying real hard to interpret something. Maybe you think that as an experimenter, I'm sort of playing a trick on you, and there is language in there if just you could listen carefully enough, or something like that. Right? And now you get all these additional activations in your baseline task that are going to muddle what you're going to find. And there are many ways in which it's going to do this, and I'll sort of try to present some of these as we go forward. How about memory? Right? There's an interesting fact about memory. Anything you're doing something, it is going in your memory store, right, to some extent. So some of that is happening all the time. You can't shut it off and say, well, I'm going to read something. All my hippocampus is done, right? I'm not going to turn that on for the baseline task. And as soon as we get into the real task, I'll switch it on, and suddenly all these pyramidal cells are going to do stuff, right? So these are the kind of questions that seem so obvious, and yet are the main pitfall of so many interesting cognitive studies that should have been extremely interesting. If you want more confounds, here are a good list. Novelty. Right? In fact, I'll give you an example on novelty. What if your baseline task happens to be unusual and therefore particularly interesting? Right? Kind of like in the backward speech I mentioned a moment ago. Or you have task repetition, could be another issue. The more you hear something, maybe your task of interest, the less kind of you're responding to it. And this is the basis for a type of design we're going to see later, priming or adaptation studies. Right, so you can see sort of how all these factors will play into whatever results you get when you perform a subtraction, right? And most task-based, in fact, I believe all task-based virtually experiments are made this way in their essence. Now you can have more sophisticated ways of doing it, but this is the heart of it, right? Comparison of two states. The number that comes out of the MRI machine itself is not interpreted quantitatively for what we care about. And then, of course, the order in which things happen is extremely important. It sounds like this should be, we should all, in second grade, the teacher should tell you, anytime you do something, counterbalance your experiment. But it turns out it's not always done for strange reasons. Sometimes it's very impractical, meaning if you want to do a full counterbalancing, you might need a number of trials you don't have. Right? A full counterbalancing would be, say that you have A and B. Half the times A precedes B, half the time B precedes A. Half the time AB is preceded by A, half the time AB is preceded by B. Half the time ABB is preceded by A, half the time ABB is preceded by B, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes very difficult to do this. So you might not be able to do that. You might be able to do something like a Latin square, right? So you see it in the last line. You might have, if you have three conditions, you might see them have different orders, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, assuming that there's no right order effects. Or of course, randomize. And I will probably end the next set of slides by stressing the importance of randomizing, but we'll get to that. Alrighty, so this is sort of the heart of it, and this is where we left it. But there's one thing that I glossed over rather quickly, which is the so-called pure insertion hypothesis. And hopefully this should ring a bell in almost all of you. The idea of the pure insertion is that when you do this kind of design, you're really saying that the reading that happens before repeating is exactly the same reading that happens when you're not repeating, right? And this is sort of what I'm challenging you to think about. Do you read in the same way? So when I subtract that piece, right, these two processes, reading plus repeating and reading by itself, am I truly subtracting off the same thing? And this is the pure insertion hypothesis says yes, absolutely. Putting an additional cognitive process after another cognitive process does not change the first cognitive process. And you can think there are plenty cognitive phenomena that you can think of. For example, co-articulation. If you have two syllables that happen one after the other, the first syllable will change according to the way in which you pronounce it, you articulate it, will change according to the syllable that comes after. This would be an example of failure of pure insertion in articulation of language. And here's a beautiful example, a portrayal of this. Let's say that we have the following experiment. We either read something silently or we read it out loud. Right? And we're going to do this under two conditions. Maybe we see a word or we see an object. And your task is to either read it or read it out loud. So if you start from the bottom row, so you see an object and you either name it silently or you actually read it out loud. And these are the two sets of activations you might see. And if you look at them, sort of you squint hard, squint, and you will see that vaguely they are comparable, let's say. Right? Maybe there's a little more cerebellum when you're actually doing the reading out loud. There's a bit more motor cortex when you're doing the reading out loud. But if you looked at them, you wouldn't fall off your chair thinking these are completely different. So does pure insertion hold this repetition, this out loud? Yeah, kind of, right? Okay, passable. Here, let's do that. Let's give it a 6 out of 10. How about when you read an actual word? And now you compare these two maps, and it becomes much worse, right? So this is literally just looking at the word house and house in your mind, and this one is house, right? Reading it out loud. And now not only they're really, really different, but some of the really interesting activations down here, these inferior frontal gyrus activations, presumably language-based, are gone entirely. Now you have a qualitatively different pattern of activation. Right? So does pure insertion hold? Which is not quite. Sorry, I had to translate that. right? Right, so these are the kind of problems as a cognitive neuroscientist you have to think about all the time, right? You're never going to go to the scanner before you've thought through completely how your original question mapped onto an MRI task, how that maps on to the cognitive processes that are happening, how your task is an embodiment of that, how the baseline task is an embodiment of everything that the real task is doing minus the one thing you really care about, and in how many ways can that fail? Right? Are your participants going to fall asleep, or will they automatically do stuff that they shouldn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just go over some of the most typical experimental designs that you're going to see you might use. There are many others, but these are sort of, this is sort of a good selection of the most typical designs you might see. And I want to highlight sort of certain pitfalls of them and the assumptions that go into it. If you take something away from this lecture is that you have to check your assumptions. You have to know what assumptions you're making. You can either check them with your own data sometimes, or know about them and discuss them, for example, in that last paragraph of your discussion section where you say, however, da, da, da. The simplest, which is the one I've sort of shown you earlier, common baseline, right? You have one or two experimental conditions and you pit them against some kind of common baseline. Here's the most standard thing I could think of: viewing pictures of faces, condition A; viewing pictures of houses, condition B; viewing scrambled images. And this feels so peaceful. I mean, it feels like such an obvious, right, design. What could be possibly wrong with this design? It's just so simple. And this, of course, allows you to compare, right, how each condition maps onto this baseline. So here's a couple examples. So here's one. Could this be problematic in any way? I'm sorry? For one, who knows, the shape of the oval might be. Although people do tend to go in the face, but well taken. You see some eyes on the right, so maybe that, your extrastriate body area might get interested. What else? Different brightness? Well, it's the exact same pixels, so it shouldn't. But how about all these vertical and horizontal lines that you don't have in the original stimulus, for one example? So how about we just take every single pixel and we just randomly scatter them throughout the image, and this is what we get. Now, this is a good control task, right? And you should be going like, So, now keep in mind that here we're controlling for a lot of things. We're controlling for the visual stimulation, the luminance, the contrast, the average spatial frequency. It's the exact same pixels. They're just scrambled around so that the low frequency signal is gone, right? The sort of, the face isn't there anymore, but it's the exact same building blocks of the face. And they're also so small that you don't really get those same lines you got before, right? They're so bothersome. Anybody sees any problem with it? I'm sorry? Well, so hopefully that's what you're trying to get at, right? But what could that, right? What problems can that, exactly this thing, lead to? Yeah?
Like, is it specific to a face or just the shape of an oval and an eye?
Interesting point. Yeah, sure. Interesting. Yeah. Come on. Yeah.
It's the same as your gibberish words that you try to look for something that's
What if I think that there's a face hidden in there, and maybe the real experiment is about how often I'm going to see the face? Maybe. And then now you have all these top-down things getting your fusiform gyrus, lighting up. Here. Right. So for one, you're assuming that you're controlling for everything except the one process of interest, right? What I said earlier. In this example, as I said, we did control for visual aspects, right? But are we really left with a pure insertion of a face? How about familiarity? Gee, I see faces all the time. I rarely see scrambled pixels. So in a sense, it's a more unfamiliar. Maybe it's more interesting. Who knows? There might be a pattern coming out of that you as the experimenter cannot control. Maybe one stimulus is not only a face, but is also way more salient than a cloud of dots. Maybe I might pay way more attention to the face because it's so interesting. I love seeing faces versus that cloud and not too much. Next point. How about emotional reactions? I mean, that's a face. There's bound to be some emotional stuff. Maybe, you know, you use language to name like, ooh, big eyebrows guy, right? Something like that, which you wouldn't do with the cloud. Memory, right? Example, he looks like my Uncle John. So you're triggering these other things. And of course, cognitive. I mean, doesn't this guy look a bit like an axe murderer? Just a little bit? Right? I mean, you think that under there's, you know, his little tag with the name and a number and LAPD or something. So it seems so innocent. It seems we know this task well, right? How many times have you read a paper that had faces versus scrambled pixels? Because it should be the most obvious thing. And yet there are all these factors playing into that. Right? So hopefully this gives you a new look at any paper you're going to read from now on, whether it has faces or other stuff in it. So you really got to do the best you can, but you have to always, right, think hard and know the ways in which this could go wrong. Now, of course, this type of common baseline does assume a number of things. It assumes that both experimental conditions have similar psychometric properties. In this case, we said it was seeing pictures of faces and pictures of houses. Do they have similar psychometric properties? Right? Are they equally difficult? Are they equally easy? Maybe seeing a face in a house might be, but what if, you know, we're particularly specialized for faces? Or what if? So you could imagine ways in which this could not hold. And this brings me to this point right here. What is an activation? How many ways are there to get a positive activation between two tasks? Obviously. Obviously. I know if you say obviously, you feel like if you say the wrong number, right? Well, at least two. How about that? One way is what you're thinking about. My task of interest activated a certain part of the brain way more than my control task. The difference is positive, bang, a nice orange blob, publication, fame, etc. But the second way of getting the exact same result is to have your task one that couldn't care less about the task. Your control task not only couldn't care less, but for some reason had a very negative response to that in terms of what we're observing. And now you still get a positive activation. Right? So now you do your analysis. You don't bother to look into your task versus nothing, right? Task versus rest. And you don't notice that the reason why you get a certain activation is because it was less active with respect to baseline in your control task as opposed to more active in your task of interest. And you're going to say, oh, this can't happen. Who would ever publish a study, right, that has this? Well, you'd be surprised. And you know, how many of you actually look at that? How many of you use something like masking versus baseline? Task A versus baseline, and you mask out anything that is negative there when you compare it to task B. How many times have you done that? Right? Not that many. And actually, so I started thinking a lot about this. It's actually not even that obvious how to do it. An FSL allows you, if you're an FSL user, allows you to do contrast masking. It's not straightforward how to actually do that contrast masking. Unfortunately, sort of, my group and I are still thinking carefully about this. So I can't, but it's not that straightforward how to allow for various boundary conditions to not get ruined by doing some kind of masking. But here's one example. Semantic decision versus rest. And notice the areas I've highlighted. Nothing, at least nothing significant by whatever threshold was used here. Nothing, nothing. Yeah, peaceful? Good. Tone detection, decision minus rest. Look at the same areas. Less than rest, less than rest, less active than rest. So now in your mind, do a subtraction, first task minus second. What color will those areas be? Bright orange. Success. My task activated parietal lobe and prefrontal cortex and frontal cortex. And of course, I couldn't be more wrong. No, my task didn't. My task of interest, semantic decision, did not activate that part of the brain. Just the task I was comparing it to had less activation in there than just rest. Yeah? And you'd think this doesn't happen. It happens all the time. You really have to look into how your task compares to just a pure rest. You really have to. In fact, we have a paper we've been working on with a colleague, And this beautiful activation creeped up in B8, and exactly where I thought it should have been, and it meant so much, and there were so many ways that it made sense to interpret it. This is about sort of certain aspects of math. It made complete sense that it'd be there. But I just, I just felt like we had to do it, and I was teaching a student of this colleague of mine how to do this, so we thought it'd be important. Boom, it was a reverse activation. Horrible. We lost it. It made complete sense. My heart was broken, but at least we didn't, publish something that would have been completely wrong. Imagine we then give that data to someone else, and they'd say, hey, this activation is not a real activation. How embarrassing would that have been, right? Now, a second big problem, which is often referred to as the imager's fallacy, is the following. What actually is an activation? So here are two tasks. This is meant to be condition A versus baseline and condition B versus baseline. And notice that condition A doesn't do much to sort of this basal, I guess, anterior basal ganglia area, whereas it really does a lot when you do task B versus baseline. And you might find that that paper says the striatum was more active in condition 2 than it was in condition 1, or sorry, condition B than it was in condition 1. By the way, Hansen 2005 is not the paper that has this quote. It's the paper talking about this issue, just to be clear. Obviously, as you know well, and there's a beautiful paper by this title, and if you are interested in stats, Google this title. It's a great little paper. Difference in significance is not itself significantly different. That's the actual original title of that paper. What do I mean? Well, that this difference in activations can come by in two ways. This difference between picture A and picture B can come by in two ways. And your problem, when you see it, is that you do not know which of the two it was. Here it is. What you're thinking right now is that it went like this. That in condition A, there was very little happening. In condition B, there was a lot happening. And it makes sense that then you'd say, well, of course, there's a lot of activation in here. There's none there. Therefore, striatum was more active by condition B versus condition A. It makes complete sense. What you forgot about is that it could also have been this, that they both activated just as much, except there was a gigantic amount of variance that prevented the activation of the striatum in condition A from having a greater effect than its variability. Right, so in your vanilla t-test kind of approach. And the problem is that unless you actually look into this, unless you actually compare two tests directly, you can't tell which of these two situations it is. So under no circumstance you are to do condition A versus baseline, condition B versus baseline. Oh, look, there's a difference here. It's not there. Therefore, condition B has more activation than condition A. You don't know that. So how do you go by solving this? Well, you use what we call a parallel comparison. You also do directly condition A versus condition B and vice versa. It seems obvious, right? I mean, it should be obvious. And yet, here we are talking about it. This is a very nice complement for, your sort of your common baseline design. Of course, it also has its own assumptions. For one, it assumes that A and B have similar psychometric properties. If they don't, the result of the direct comparison will be that whatever is psychometrically different, who knows, like difficulty or something like that, as opposed to your process of interest, right? So you see this sort of these hypotheses just come back to bite you in every way you could. But at least now you can claim something about the relative activations across these two conditions. A design that I've enjoyed using a lot in the past is called the tailored baseline. The idea here is that sometimes the things go back to the faces and houses, right? Faces versus scrambled and houses versus scrambled. Is it fair to compare either faces to the scrambled houses or houses to the scrambled faces? Or faces to the average of the scrambled faces and scrambled houses and houses to the average of scrambled faces, scrambled houses, right? It's not fair because now you're no longer using the same pixels. Right? So sometimes it might be convenient to have a tailored baseline for each condition. So now faces would be against scrambled faces and houses would be against scrambled houses, which is sort of this example. Here's one example. All right, I need your deductive engines to fire up. Z was paid X by Y. Is that the same as it was X that Y paid Z? Are these two sentences the same? Do they mean the same? Do they mean the same? course they do. I know, it's so embarrassing to answer a question publicly. Don't worry. I do this every time. And the only reason why I know the answer is because I left the check marks on there. And I mean, I conceived it in the first place, but I still sometimes go. And now compare that to doing this. X minus y is greater than z. Is that the same as z plus y is smaller than x? Right, and I'll spare you. Yes. Right. In your mind, you might be able to see x minus y greater than z, and you can twist them around, flip the sign, and you'll get right. And I was interested at the time in sort of the question I asked earlier, right? Is are the routines of language within inferior frontal gyrus doing similar tasks, similar things in other domains, such as, for example, algebra, which a lot of people have sort of made parallel to language. And so maybe your task is this, right? You show two sentences and you say, are they the same, yes or no? Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, right? And as I said, your task is, do the two sentences match? But now, of course, I need a control task, right? And the problem is that I need a different control task for each of my two conditions. So a control task might be something as simple as reading the sentences and just saying, is there a grammatical mistake in there or not? Right? So I showed the exact same sentences again, but your task now is just to read them and to detect if there's an error in there. Of course, for this task to work, there can never be an error, because else you can't evaluate them. So every now and then, there might be a funny sentence. Let's see, 2x was made by z for y. No, that one, it was z, yeah, that x made for y. 2x was made by z for, oh yeah, exactly. 2x was made. I think there's no error in this. Are these two grammatically correct? Both of them? It was z that x made for right? They're a bit odd. Okay, good. I'll get to a point about this particular time. Z divided by y equals z times. Oh yeah, exactly. The bottom one is incorrect, right? And the top one here is incorrect. Y equals z times greater than x. Doesn't work, right? Now the good thing is that we never analyzed these trials for this reason, because I don't know what's happening. But they did keep our subjects engaged, right? Because else they would be all correct. But now, how many problems can you see in this? I mean, come on, I just have a couple that are like really itching to come out. And I don't take it personally, it's just the way it is. How many problems do you see? I just gave you an example of how this task might fire back, right? So you read these once and you do the deduction, you read these a second time and you're just evaluating them by grammatical correctness. Come on, what's the clear problem that is gonna happen in here? Obviously, you might think that the deduction trials, that the comparison might happen automatically. As soon as you see it, because I've taught you to compare the two sentences for so many trials, now as soon as you see it, you really want to start comparing them. And now you're triggering the very cognitive processes that I want to see in the real task, not in the baseline, right? So how would you, now a reviewer tells you this, and you know, no task is perfect. What are you gonna do about it? If the reviewer said, but wait a second, how'd you know that your subjects weren't just looking at this, doing the grammar trials, just reading them, but not only reading them, also doing the matching? How would I know if they were doing the matching or not? Could I know? Well, here's one, great, but it's something. The response times were just so dramatically different. 5 seconds versus 14 on average. So that's a pretty good, but of course I don't know that there isn't some part of the thinking that has been canceled out by this approach, pitfall. Second, when I do the two tailored, how do I know that the baselines between the linguistic inference and the algebraic inferences are similar? I mean, language statements are just so much more familiar than algebraic statements, particularly seen in language clothing, right? It's weird, how many times have you really read, you know, y equals z times x? It's very unfamiliar, right? So now my reviewer tells me this, and I'm sort of back, and I say, gosh, now what can I do about it? What are you gonna do about it? Let's blame it on you. This is your study. What are you gonna do about this? Right? Well, here's one thing that worked in our case, together with the reaction times. We actually compared, you know, with a standard statistical technique, the two baselines. Are they any different? It turns out at the group level they're not. Does that really mean that they're the same? But better than nothing. If there had been differences in there, then we would have already known that there clearly were differences and our subtractions were not sort of parallel in that way. Again, all I'm saying is, I'm not trying to show that I'm a bad experimental scientist. The opposite. And I have an experiment, it works well for certain reasons, it addresses the conceptual question I'm after, but it will have some downsides. And virtually any experiment you do will have criticizable aspects. So it's on you to go verify them, to try to find out what would convince you that, that it's not a problem. Yep. And if you're really curious, here's what turns out. That to do the language problems, you get a lot of language areas in the front and the back, whereas to do the algebraic problems, you don't. Interesting, if you care about it. And we've done this both in the tailored baselines, right? Each task versus its own baseline. And then, of course, we directly compare the two, and we get kind of the same result. If you care about this sort of thing. There it is. Now, as I sort of mentioned in the example, again, this kind of designs assumes that control tasks remove equally across your two conditions task-specific things, right? I need my baseline for language to remove language-specific things that are not the thinking about order and who did what to whom, as much as I need my math baseline to take off sort of the specifics about just reading a statement that is algebraic in nature. Right? Do they? Well, that's what you should ask yourself if you ever use a design like this. Right? Yet again, it assumes similar psychometric properties, probably unlikely. Again, reaction time is something that you could use, right, to look at whether there are systematic differences across your baselines or across your tasks. Very important. And it is a good idea to then have a lower level baseline that you could use, even just rest, right, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And as I said, it might be a good idea to compare the two baselines. Are there actually differences? Because if you do get a significant difference, and you could think that when you compare the baselines as we did, we used an extremely liberal thresholding. Just if there's anything, let's just see it. Turns out we were very lucky, no difference. But it could have turned out differently. Here are another few that you might see less often, but that are extremely interesting ways of going by doing this. One is a so-called hierarchical design. And this really, what you're doing is you're using, you have a set of tasks, and each kind of sits at a different level within some kind of cognitive hierarchy. So you might end up having task A and compare that to rest, task B, and you compare that to task A. So presumably task B has all of the tasks in A plus something. And then maybe you have task C, which has all of the cognitive processes in A, all of the cognitive processes in B, plus some other cognitive process. And you can kind of unravel this hierarchy a step at a time. Right? Beautiful example by Jenny Rod and colleagues, 2005. Task A was listening to noise. This, in fact, is so-called signal correlated noise. It kind of sounds like something of that sort. Very interesting. Task B was listening to sentences. And task C was listening to ambiguous sentences, like she would, where words have multiple meanings, right? Multiple words within each sentence had multiple meanings. And the idea was that by virtue of having all these words that have multiple meanings, you're kind of accessing more your semantic dictionary, that sort of thing. And then, of course, you can do all these comparisons. Noise versus rest, sentences greater than noise, ambiguous sentences greater than just non-ambiguous sentences, right? And this was actually, this was a very successful paper. So you can find out in the first subtraction, kind of the low-level auditory processes. What does it take on top of those to actually process language, which is not just any noise, it's a specifically organized type of noise. On top of that, what does it take to process language, which not only is a certain specific organized type of noise, but also has within it semantic ambiguities. Right? And you can slowly decompose a hierarchy of cognitive processes, right, that you might be interested in. Obviously, you are assuming that the pure insertion holds at each of these levels, which unlikely to be the case, but you are assuming that. Another very often used design is the parametric design, and really you're just doing something like increasing along some dimension a variable of the stimulus, the variable of interest. Typically, we use one dimension. You might have something that gets bigger or louder or brighter or that sort of thing. A good example is working memory. Right? You might be familiar with the n-back task, exactly an example of parametric design. 0-back task, every time the dot is at the top, you press. Right? 1-back task, when the dot matches the position of the dot in the previous screen, you press. So all you're keeping in mind is one item, right, the previous screen. 2-back task, every time the dot matches the position 2 screens ago, now you press. Which means you have to keep in mind the screen of 2 screens ago, plus the screen in the middle, because you're going to need it for the next trial. Terribly hard thing to do. Not to mention the 3-back task, even worse. Right? Now you have to, but you are, at least intuitively, you are parametrically modulating how much effort somebody is doing. Right? Now, are things linear in the world of fMRI? Well, good question, right? And certainly, at the very least, you're assuming a type of pure modulation. You're assuming that at every time you notch up whatever process you're looking at, it's still the exact same process. You're just doing more of it. Yeah? That's the assumption. Of course, it does assume that you can actually find a dimension to manipulate this way. And here's one beautiful example in the domain of vision by Boynton and colleagues, now quite a few years ago, showing the linear relationship between the contrast and the amplitude of a bold response. Right? Beautiful, very linear. But then you go into the n-back task, and now it turns out that your 2-back task and 3-back task really looks like completely different beasts. Right? So are you manipulating something along one dimension? It seems to me there's something different going on. Right? Let me go over really quickly 2 last experimental type of experimental design. One is so-called selective attention. I find this one particularly beautiful. And the idea is you use the exact same stimulus, but what you have to do is pay attention to different aspects of it. area is about visual features, if you have the same word in different fonts, there should be no priming, right? Because it's a different, visually it's a different thing entirely. If instead it's a semantic area, when you get two words in a different font, but same meaning, you should see priming. Right? And this is pretty much what happened. Here's our deactivation, and here's what happened. If you have the different words in the same font, this is how much response you get. All right? That's kind of a benchmark. If you have the same word in the same font, different words in the same font, that's how much you get. Same word, same font, you get a nice decrease. Okay? This is obvious. You're seeing the same word twice. That's the priming effect. What happens now when you get different caps? If you have different word in different fonts, obviously you get a lot of response, no priming. And here's a crucial one. If you get the same word in different fonts, what happens? If it's a semantic area, you're going to see depression. If it's a visual area, you should see no depression. Right? And there you have it. Right? Beautiful example of how to leverage on different experimental designs to ask real questions, right? That you'd be proud to ask as a cognitive psychologist or a neurobiologist. Summary, no design is perfect. They all make assumptions, but you got to know what your assumptions are. You got to be prepared to try to defend them. Before you ever get to a reviewer, test them. Do the reaction time support what you were saying? Pilot your tasks, right? Try to get a good, strong grip on your task. Multiple baselines might be a good thing to have. And of course, always, as I was saying, beware of your assumptions. And I think for now, I will leave it at this. So there's a 30-minute between now and next time.
There's a break.
I will.
Includes time for questions.
Perfect. Time for questions. Yeah. Sorry, Mike.
Hi. So in the ROD study, they were comparing silence to noise.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. So silence compared to noise compared to
Silence
other
compared to noise, compared to sentences, compared to ambiguous sentences.
So is it an assumption that they must have known about and tested that the subjects might have been like, oh, there's no noise, so it's silence in the MRI. Is that an issue and
Right.
something they addressed?
So they used a so-called silent sequence. So in that sense, there wasn't the loud beeping. There was one period of beeping and then silence, nothing, 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 and then beeping, and then nothing, 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 beeping, nothing. So they didn't, and all conditions were equated on this point. So in a sense, sure, a subject might have said, oh, gosh, that's so strange. I mean, this thing yesterday beeped so loud. But that would be happening across all levels, I would imagine, right? There'd be, as long as, the real point you're making is, did they counterbalance, did things happen counterbalance? And of course they were. And if they hadn't, then you'd imagine that that could have been a problem. Very important.
Just curious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Should get the mic, sort of. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. In terms of the priming experiments, and one of the things that I think the literature is debated about is what is really happening. I mean, Alex Martin has been going.
Is it neural versus non-neural?
Or is it pruning versus, I mean, what's happening to the signal? Is it the case that the neurons are going down, all of them? Or is it the case that some of them are still up there and then the rest that don't care about it? It doesn't change exactly what you said, and I think it's a nice paradigm, but I know there was a lot of discussion about whether we should use it or not. Another thing that I wanted to ask you is, within the priming, I really think it's interesting to see the release from adaptation. So when you, if you have a parametric manipulation of that, when you release from adaptation, does it go really up again, or do you have a tuning? It's a tuning function, essentially.
See, I think that's a perfectly legal and interesting question that you'd ask, and you'd have a really good design for doing it, right? See, that's leveraging on the power of different designs to ask interesting questions. With respect to the first, I'll put it this way. I am no authority in that field, but there are neural recording studies showing decrease in neural activation. Now, whether the bold signal, which is so many steps away from neural events, is the degree to which the reduction we see in the bold signal maps onto the neural adaptation, I couldn't tell. Certainly there is neural adaptation. It just so happens to happen when we do it in bold exactly in the ways we'd expect. But absolutely, there are so many other things that are causing that. For one, the change in diameter of your blood vessels. That for one is not going to go up infinitely. As you repeat a study, else your head would sort of gigantically explode, which would not be good for the IRB. More questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm wondering, so what are the possible reasons for the reversal activation? I mean, in what cases we can explain the reversal activation in the same way as the positive activation?
Yeah, so if Dr. Buchheimer were here, she would say, do not call them deactivations. And the reason, if you think about it, what you're comparing is just an unknown set of processes. It's not that your brain is empty, right? It's not that nothing is happening. I have friends like that, but it's not that nothing is happening at rest, right? So in a sense, all that is saying is that whatever task you're overtly imposing on your subject is not requiring, is actually requiring less of a certain part of the brain than whatever task somebody spontaneously engages in. So it's not really a deactivation in that sense. You're not deactivating the brain. It's just whatever is the overt task doesn't seem to recruit as much as whatever is the implicit or the whatever is the task that is happening, but that you're not imposing on the subject during rest periods, right? If you're doing that comparison, you can't say it's a deactivation. You can't interpret it as it's sort of, there's no absolute zero, right? Your zero is in fact a number that is determined by whatever your participant is doing in those periods, right? It's not a real zero, it's not a negative number. That's what I'm trying to say. It's just a relative comparison. That's why you shouldn't call them deactivation.
So another question is, under which circumstance can we say that is the deactivation?
I would not use the word deactivate. Now, if you compare two tasks, you can say it was less active, it was more active in one task than the other. But if you're having a rest baseline, or you can't say deactivation because again, there's no zero. It's not a negative. It could be an anti-correlation, it could be, but it's not a deactivation. Yeah. Or two, yeah, whichever you can reach first. By this random walk.
So I have two questions.
Sure.
When you mentioned using two different baselines,
yeah.
Like you mentioned that you did not see any difference, right? Between, what would it mean if you did see the difference?
Yeah. If you did see the difference, I would think that you'd want to somehow take account for it. I haven't looked too carefully in it, but for one example, FSL allows you to use a voxel-wise covariate. So something where each voxel can have a specific number. You could imagine that you could use that as a covariate. You could say, look, my two baselines, I know they vary in a certain place, and I will take account of that. Meaning, if I see a difference in this place, I cannot tell if it's a real difference or if it's just due to the reverse type subtraction, right? You can think of that. I haven't quite, since it didn't happen, I sort of didn't really cross that bridge. I think you would have to sort of, you'd have to take account of that. It could even just be saying, well, these two sets of tasks, so task A and control A, had this bias to them, which is they had this additional process that was true across both, right? So if then you compare the A and B, right, then you have to keep that in mind. You can say, well, I don't really know if this region, if this extra activation is specific to my task versus just to whatever was the overall, let's say algebra versus reasoning about algebra, which is what I cared about. But you do have to get clever in that case, because that would be problematic.
And my second point is not really a question, but can you talk more about priming? Because it was very fast, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I see the watch, and in fact, I'm eating into question times, which I hate, and not only I'm eating into my own next lecture, which is even worse. But here, I will go over the basic idea, right? The basic idea is that before some stimulus of interest, right, the last one, right, you kind of show something that will get a population, that might or might not get a population of neurons excited, right? And the real crux is whether the thing that you show before, the subliminal stimulus, does that share a feature with the stimulus you're really showing? And does that part of the brain care about this feature? Right? That's really the crux of it. So if this piece of the brain cared about font size, for example, then whatever gets activated by this subliminal mask should not intersect whatever should be activated by the real stimulus. i.e., you should not get a decrease, right? Remember, if you activate something the first time, you get a nice big response. If you activate it a second time, you kind of get a little less, right? So if that piece of the brain doesn't care about whatever feature is fixed between the two, then you shouldn't see that effect. If instead that piece of the brain cares about the meaning of the word radio, then those neurons will jump up when the subliminal stimulus is up, and then they will jump up less the second time around because they've already been excited. And so when you get exposed to something multiple times, the activation sort of decreases in intensity. That's sort of the heart of it. I think there was a question back there.
Oh, I was just wondering whether the type of mechanism of deactivation can exist. Thinking of two scenarios. So one is really, like in terms of blood supply. So if some area get activated, so then you have to shut off or reduce the blood supply to some other area.
Yeah, so does it get constricted?
Yeah,
Really?
so anyway, that is kind of, really you get deactivated another area. Or neurologically, when some area is active, then somehow they need to suppress some other functional area.
Yeah.
I thought that might be possible.
So in a limited pool model, that would happen, right? In a model where the resources are fixed and you have a blanket and you can pull it one way and it comes away from the other, that would be exactly what would happen. But if you look at studies that actually look at, for one, the dilation of blood vessels during stimulation, you do this by stimulating some nerve, the sciatic nerve of a rat, and then looking at the terminals of the blood vessels nearby that and other branches of the same sort of larger vessel, you will get a change, you will get an increase, and it will be stronger, the closer to the place of stimulation, but you're not really going to get a constriction. At least the data I'm thinking of didn't show any constriction of the other blood vessels around. So it would imply that it's not quite a blanket that you're pulling around, or it's an elastic blanket, if you want. That will allow you some kind of, well, at least to start thinking about interpretation the way you're thinking. Yeah. Coffee time? Let's just end, yeah, and then let's see. And then we restart as of the schedule, we're restarting in exactly 15 minutes. Is that right? Okay. Perfect. Perfect for coffee.
Thank you for doing it.
Of course, it's a pleasure. problem. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. Congratulations on all being alive. I will say the same tomorrow after we've gone through 3 or more hours of statistical analysis. I'm serious. You think I was joking? But if you have trouble sleeping, I will resolve it. So
Who doesn't love the Martin Moffat show?
Sure.
For 2 days.
Yeah, yeah. All those regressors and estimators. How can you have a bad feeling about those? All right, so what I'd like to do now is let's just imagine you've narrowed down on the exact task you want to do. You've narrowed down on what you want your subjects to do, which means you've translated your conceptual design into an actual task that you can have someone do in an MRI machine. You have your stimuli set, you have conditions A, B, baselines, all of that. Now there's an empirical question about how you're going to organize the events inside the MRI machine. And it turns out how you actually organize the events has quite a big impact on what happens, I guess on power, for example, and many other issues that are very important. So the most standard, traditional, vanilla, call it what you will, design is to do a block design. And this came straight in from PET. This is exactly how you do it. Right? You'd inject something, and after a little while, you'd have somebody do a lot of task A, maybe seeing a bunch of faces, then you'd have a big break, and then you'd acquire more data later when they were not seeing faces or something of that sort. A nice block design. In this case, maybe you might see face, 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 face for 30 seconds, then nothing, 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 and house, 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 and then nothing, 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 and face, 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 et cetera, et cetera. Maybe in blocks, who knows, of 30 seconds on and off, something of that sort. The standard block design, it has a lot of upsides and some downsides. And I want to force you to think about what are the upsides and the downsides. Let me start by comparing this block design to so-called space mixed trials, or you probably know them as a slow event-related design. Right? And the idea is that now, instead of sort of putting nearby all these trials, often prevents you from doing certain things. And because of those things, it might be advantageous for you to actually have a trial, then a little break, then another trial, a little break, another trial, a little break. And I'll go sort of over some of these issues. Actually, sorry, let me just... Could see, there we go, okay, perfect. There we go. Alrighty. Right, so you might choose to do this, and I will come back to why you might choose to do this. Just because it's a traditional or old, it doesn't mean it's any less good. In fact, it has a lot of, as I was saying, positives going for it. If you ever can, then this is probably one of your best designs. But if you can't, and there are many reasons, and I'll get into them, then you might do something more akin to this, right? Little condition break, condition break. There are two things will strike you right off the bat. And one is that now you can, of course, intersperse, right, different conditions. So you can have condition A, B, A, B, B, A, B, A, B, etc., which you couldn't really do right up here. And I'll get back to these particular details in a moment on why you might want to choose an event-related design. And so the idea is that now, instead of sort of getting an overall response for 30 seconds of doing, being hammered with task A, you can actually sort of get the individual response to every single trial. So maybe, who knows, I think in this experiment you are hearing words. So you hear one word and you get the full deflection, the full bold response elicited by that one stimulus, and then it returns to baseline, and then boom, the next one, the next one. And you can actually see right here, right, the response of this particular voxel. In fact, you can even average them and kind of get the average profile, right, of what happens upon hearing a linguistic stimulus. Now, of course, the question is, why on earth would you do this as opposed to block design? And there are many reasons. I just want to highlight sort of the most typical ones. But you might think of your own experimental design and think of why, right, in your design it was so optimal to do an event-related design as opposed to a block design. For one, and this is probably one of the most obvious ones, you can randomize the conditions or the events happening, right? Which you can't with a block design, or at least with a block design, you can't randomize individual occurrences. You can just randomize sets of occurrences, which might or might not be good. In particular, oftentimes having sort of block designs will create expectations or things like that that are problematic and that start meddling up with your task of interest. Right, so for example, imagine this is your timeline, and now you wanted to use block design, and maybe you scary picture, scary picture, scary picture, break, 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 non-scary picture, non-scary picture, non-scary picture, right, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, first of all, what's happening is extremely transparent. Your subjects are going to develop straight away strategies on how to cope with this. I mean, the simplest of all, if your subjects were really averse to the stimuli, what could your subject do? Close their eyes, right? As soon as they see the very first stimulus, oh my gosh, I'm in a scary block. I'll close my eyes and won't look at it. And I'll sort of wait a little bit until I feel I can open my eyes again and look at the beautiful pictures. So of course, right, these block designs might trigger all sorts of cognitive sets and things like that, which, as sort of we spoke about earlier, are going to be very hurtful to your analysis. So that's sort of one of the most basic ideas behind actually jittering these. Actually interspersing these rather than in blocks in single events. And now, of course, you might have, oh, scary, nice, scary, scary, nice. And you might even think that every time you're getting sort of a full response to each of these stimuli, which is much better. And in particular, you're really minimizing these expectations of strategy by just randomizing your stimuli and just, submitting them to your participant in a completely random order that they cannot anticipate. Therefore, they cannot create strategies, expectations, and things like that. And I mean, if you've ever been a subject to an MRI study, to task-based fMRI study, you will know that when you're in there, you're really trying to figure out what's happening. You're coming up with all sorts of theories on how these stimuli reach you, and your subjects will do that. Right? Most universities, your vanilla undergrad is probably very clever and does great on GREs and is really trying to figure this out to show who's boss. So here's why you might want to use event-related designs. Another good idea is that it actually allows you to do things that you couldn't do with block designs. For example, you might classify post hoc what is condition A and what is condition B. Beautiful example now in '98 by Wagner and colleagues. And they showed a number of words and during scanning, one after the other, sort of in this slow event-related design. And your task as a subject was to, I believe, to report whether it's a physical object or not, right? Or something abstract or concrete noun, something of that sort. And you just see word after word and you say concrete, abstract, concrete, abstract. But the task was not sort of what they were interested in was not whether something is an abstract or concrete word, but they were interested in what does it take or what is different about things that you recall later on versus things that you don't recall later on. So what happened after the scanning is they would surprise the participant by saying, oh, I forgot. Could you just fill out this little questionnaire for me? And they had a recognition memory test, right? They'd show words and say, was this there? And they'd see if the participants, which words they would remember and which not. Now, you can analyze your data by taking all the words that were remembered and looking at the activations at encoding of those words versus all the words that were not remembered. And now you can try to see if you can tell something about what is different about words that spontaneously get recalled later on versus words that somehow faded, right? Their trace kind of faded out of your ear. So what they do after is they would take hits and compare those to the misses or the forgotten. Clearly, you do not know beforehand what is a hit and what is a miss. Therefore, there's no way that you can block hits or misses, right? You can only do this after. And if you had a sort of, you can't even create a block design, right, doing this. This would be another great reason to use a slow event-related design. Interestingly enough, you might see real differences when you look into the parahippocampal or fusiform gyri in terms of the remembered answers that tend to have sort of higher responses versus the forgotten ones that tend to have lower responses, right? So they wouldn't have been able to do this if it weren't for a slow event-related design. Interestingly enough, in areas that are not really memory tied, like visual cortex and motor cortex, there wasn't a significant difference between the remembered and forgotten, which if you were a reviewer, you would want to ask for. You just want to make sure that this is just not that subjects every now and then close their eyes and missed a word, and that's why they forgot it. They didn't recall it. Again, always have your reviewer cap on when you're coming up with your experiment. Think, if I were the reviewer, what would I say about this? Best way for you to sort of preempt some of the questions you could get. Alrighty. Now, sometimes, similarly to the previous experiment, really sometimes events can only the subjects can tell you when he or she is in condition A or condition B, right? And you can leverage this in very interesting ways. Frank Tong, a number of years ago, did a really cool experiment on binocular rivalry, and it went something like this. So you'd have a stimulus, and you can see there are, similarly to the stimulus I showed you earlier from my experiment, there are two things overlaid on top of each other, and participants would have those sort of fancy eyeglasses with a red and a green lens, which means that really what they would see is sometimes the stimulus would turn into face, and you'd really be focusing, your perception would be the face, and then it would flip, and now it's the house, and it would go back and forth, right? But the problem is that it happens spontaneously. You can't tell the subject in this design, in my design I could, but in this design, the subject will tell you, oh, now I'm seeing face, click. Now I'm seeing house, click. Now I'm seeing face, click. Now I'm seeing house, click. So in this case, only the subject can tell you when they are in condition A and when they're in condition B. The particularly clever thing that Frank did is that they recorded the timing that somebody spent in the face and then in the house and the switching, and then they replayed the stimuli really showing a face and really showing a house at exactly the same timing, what they call the yoked condition. So earlier you had this spontaneous switching and you saw face for a little while, house for a little while, and then they recorded when the subject said that things switched, and then they replayed a sequence but showing a real face and a real house. And then of course they'd look at whether these two things compare. So how different is it to have this attentional spontaneous shift versus an actual perceptual shift? Right. And it turns out actually you get similar activations, and sort of my study that I showed you earlier implies the same thing. So a very clever way of doing it. In fact, for example, in the yoked condition, when you're actually seeing a face and then flipping to a house, if you're seeing a house, let's say I'm flipping to a face, the fusiform suddenly gets really excited and the PPA gets all upset and sort of sad. And the same was true for vice versa, right? If you first see a face and switch to a house, the FFA now becomes sad and the PPA suddenly is all excited. Now this is when you're actually perceptually seeing differences. And what is interesting is that pretty much the same thing happened when it was your perception changing, but the stimuli was identical, right? So the stimulus you're seeing is the same ambiguous stimulus, but your own perception is shifting. You kind of see a very similar thing, right? For example, here from house to face, here's suddenly the FFA getting all excited and the PPA getting all depressed. So again, this is a condition in which a block design just couldn't work. Now, some things just cannot be blocked. And if you ever used an oddball paradigm, that cannot be blocked, right? So, if you're not familiar with them, it works something like this. You establish a standard and then you violate it, right? Standard, so here we go. You're my participant, yeah? The stimulus will appear there. Standard, 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 non-standard, standard. If you missed it, that was the oddball. Right? Now, I cannot create an oddball experiment unless I can create a context that has a standard. The oddball is the violation of a standard, so I need to be able to establish a standard to then violate it. Right? Of course, you cannot block oddballs. If you block oddballs, you're doing the opposite. Now your oddball is a standard, right? It doesn't work. So these are all types of designs that you can't do in a blocked way, right? Sorry, I'm gonna skip this one because I forgot to take it off from the slide. One important thing, and this gets often lost, it's not always obvious when the event of interest is, or rather, your decision upon when the event is happening can change profoundly what you're looking at. Here's an example. Be my participant for a second, all right? Keep your eyes on the screen. You're my participant, and this is the stimulus. You're inside the MRI machine. I'll go BBB while this happens. Right? So probably something happened in your mind. You've noticed there was something weird, right, happening. Now, if I place my event here, and model everything that happens from here to the end, what cognitive processes am I capturing? Obviously. Anything that has to do with language, right? But obviously, being a participant, you've noticed that there's something else going on, which is, of course, linguistic in nature, but really just happened here. So now, given the exact same stimulus, exact same experimental design, exact same everything, according to where I place my stimulus, the result of what I'm looking at is completely different. Yeah? The actual sort of what happens once you reach a violation in these kind of garden path sentences, and now suddenly you have to go back and recreate the whole tree in a different way, right, to make sense of what's happening. Not trivial, right, and can get lost, and you can end up with results that mean something completely different than what you originally intended. Now, let me spend 1 second talking about why not event-related designs. What's good about block designs, right? Well, for one, block designs are statistically more powerful. I mean, a block design, you're literally doing the fmri equivalent of hammering someone, right, with a certain, I mean, you can hammer someone with checkerboards, with, I don't know, faces. I mean, you're really getting those parts of the brain as excited as they possibly could, given your stimulation, right? So if your design, if your task of interest is amenable to a block design, geez, from a statistical point of view, it's great. Not only, some psychological processes are really difficult to switch on and off, right? So a little while back, I was using quite a bit mental imagery for my experiments. And, you know, an experiment would be like something like, close your eyes, imagine playing tennis. Right? And then after a little while, say, okay, now stop. And then now restart, imagine playing tennis. Now stop. And it's kind of tough to start and stop quickly and at random this process. It's easier to sort of start it and then maintain it for a little while, and you really envision yourself on a tennis field and swinging your arms, something of that sort. It's tough to do short events of this imagery because it kind of takes a certain effort, and it takes time to develop it and to really engage in it. So I tried sort of shortening my blocks. It just wouldn't work. This really worked well with nice 30-second block design on and off. Right? And it didn't work any better at all the variations that I've tried in this experimental design. So in this case, a nice block design was the best I could do. Of course, you might keep in mind that excessively complicated designs are difficult for subjects. They have to remember, they get confused, and now just wonder how good is the data you're acquiring. Right? So these are all good reasons to stick with a block design if you could. Now, of course, there's an obvious there's an obvious pitfall of this kind of designs. If you just compare the number of events that are happening in your block versus your slow event related, it's clear that we are having many fewer events. Not only, we have way more junk time that we're paying very handsomely for, right? All these spaces in between add up to more than these 30 seconds off periods. And by having fewer trials, we have less power, et cetera, et cetera. Our estimate is less work, blah, 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 blah. So the answer to that is what a lot of people do now. I feel it's a fairly conventional experimental design at this point, which is a rapid event-related design. You might call it a jittered design, and I'll get into that detail in a second. Now, the idea is that this is where we were, right? We stimulate someone, and then we wait for the full deflection of the hemodynamic response function. We wait for it to come back down, and then we hit the person again, and we get the deflection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, instead, it goes more something like this. Here's the example of a jittered event-related design. Here's one event, then nothing, event, then another event right after it, then two events, then a tiny break, then another two, another break, another one, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And so now, by using this principle, I can actually jam back in there way more stimuli than I could do, way more events than I could do with the slow event-related design. The problem, of course, is that now my hemodynamic response is overlapping across trials. Right? So now, for example, this one here is a nice response to one trial, but then this big thing here actually has two trials in it, and you know, I gotta be able to tease apart how much of this big thing comes from A and how much of it comes from B, et cetera. Right? Obviously, in the same length, which is the biggest positive, in the same length, I can pack way more trials. But as I was saying, the hemodynamic response now overlap, and that is problematic. So this, of course, begs the question, well, how do you tease apart right? How much of this big thing here comes from condition A versus condition B, right? The neighboring one. It turns out that really there's one key assumption that when you're doing this, you are making. And it's worth thinking about whether it's a reasonable assumption or not. And I will try to get into that detail in just a second. But really what you're saying is, look, my system is kind of, if you take a simple input out, let's just reduce what we're doing to a simple input out system. For example, neural activity fMRI signal. Just this simple system. Well, the system is linear if it really has two features at the same time, at least. One is scaling, and one is superposition. Right? And sort of superposition. Now, if a system, the beauty of this is that if a system is linear, then it's fairly easy to go back and say, oh, look, this much of that big curve came from task A, and this much came from trial 3 and trial 4. Right? You can tease those apart. Sort of in a sense, you can resolve this overlap, right, problem. Now, what does it mean that a system has scaling? Fairly intuitive. The greater a stimulation, the greater the response, right? So as simple as it could be. Probably familiar to all of you. Now, how many of you do fast jitter event related designs with overlapping responses? Okay, good. You know a question is about to is the bold response, does the bold response have a nice linear scaling? Of course, I wouldn't be asking if the answer were yes. And yet, all of you, guilty people, and myself, have published papers that assume that. And here's a beautiful demonstration. This is data from Bob Savoy. And this was just a visual stimulation. And you can see these three lines are the visual. The arrow indicates the onset of the stimulation. The HRF, the bold response to 34 milliseconds of stimulation, to 100 milliseconds, to 1 second. And it suffices to look at this to know the system is not scaling in a sort of nice, obvious linear fashion. It does scale, just not quite linearly. So, can we assume scaling, right? Is the right sort of question. Well, here's a beautiful experiment that really breaks it down. And the interesting thing is that they actually, if you look at this data, you can almost come up with an envelope where scaling might be a reasonable assumption to make. Now, this is Robson and colleagues, and they did something very ingenious. The stimuli were auditory tones, and you could either have one auditory tone, two auditory tones, four auditory tones, 8, 16, et cetera, et cetera. And then they did the following. They said, well, if the system is linear and scales linearly, I should be able to take the response to one tone, multiply it by 2, and approximate pretty well the response to 2 tones. Right? I should be able to take the response to 1, multiply it by 128 times, and get a reasonable approximation of a response to 128 tones. Right? Now, what you're seeing here, the bold line is the actual empirical response to 4 tones in a row, 8 tones in a row, 16 rounds in a tone, etc. And the light line is the inferred expected response on the basis of multiplying the response to 1 16 times, response to 1 32 times, response to 1 64 times. And it doesn't take a lot of stats to notice how far off we actually are when we do this. Okay? And sort of they do this in a number. So then you can take the response to 2, multiply it by 2, and you should be able to approximate 4. Multiplied by 4, you should be able to approximate response to 8. Multiplied by 8, you should be able to approximate response to 16, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that we still are quite a bit off. Right? By the time you get a response to 4, then your approximation is actually not that bad. But it's very clear at this point that the system does scale, but not linearly. Right? There's something happening that is preventing that is not making it linear. So can you assume scaling? Well, scaling, yes. Linear scaling, right? The second thing is superposition. And the idea is that if I have response to stimulus A, and I know the response to stimulus B, then I should be able to add them simply to get the response to A and then B when they're overlapping. Is this the case? So, in fact, if I see, if this is my experimental design, but earlier I also had this, I should be able to take these two guys, subtract this guy, and be left with exactly this. Right? If the system is linear, then you should get this. Dale and Buckner bothered to look at this. They had a as simple as interesting experimental design. Sometimes they had a single stimulation, visual stimulation. This is the one trial. Then they had sometimes two trials, one after a little bit after the other, and sometimes three trials, on, off, on, off, on, off. You can see it here, sort of one, then two with a little break in between, and then three each with a little break in between. If you take the response to one trial, there it is, and you see there are two lines. I think it's even trials and odd trials, so nothing that you need to worry about, the two lines. And now, let's look at the response to two. If indeed the system works out the way we expect it to be, we should be able to take the response to two, subtract off the response to one, and we should be left exactly with the response to the second one. And not only, because these two stimuli are exactly the same, what we should be left with an exact copy of this guy, just translating it in time, right? It should start around here, right? Once you subtract the one event from the two event. Turns out, not exactly the same. It turns out that the estimated second trial is a slight underestimate of the original trial. And then, of course, you can take the 3, subtract the 2, and then subtract the 1, right? Sorry, and then take what remains and subtract the 1 from what remains. And now you have, and now you should have the response to each one of those 3. And it turns out, you can see them right here, the response to the 3 events back to back are not the same. These are not perfectly overlapping lines, which they should be. So this tells you that actually, right, you cannot assume that if you have 2 overlapping things, you can perfectly recover each individual response. And the problem to you is that this creeps up in all sorts of ways. For example, let's say that you're interested in, you play words to a participant. What you're seeing up here is the response, the magnitude of the response to 10 words over a minute. Okay, if you play 10 words over a minute, which means each word is spaced, right, 6 seconds away from the previous one and the one after. For a given word, right, take word number 5 in there, the response to that one word is, on average, this big. If you have 15 words per minute, then the magnitude of the response of that one word is still kind of the same. But now put it in the context of 30 words per second. So now the spacing is only a couple seconds. Now the magnitude response to that same word is actually, right, is greatly decreasing. Now go to 1 hertz, and now the response is less than half, is almost, less than a third, just about a third of the response to that same word in the context of, right, few trials. So this is how this creeps into your effect. Right? Not only, you thought it was that simple. A different way of showing the exact same thing is when you're deciding how much spacing you want to put in between your trials. Here's the response to a single trial in black, and in red you're seeing the response to a second trial that happens 8 seconds later. Now do that 6 seconds later. Now do that 4 seconds later. Now do that 2 seconds later. Now do that 1 second later. Right? And you can see it's very nonlinear, the way in which it decreases. So this is the ways in which this problem creeps up in your experimental design and diminishes the effect that you are seeing. Not only, you'd think that this is the same across the brain. Turns out, not quite the case. What you're seeing here is if you had 2 trials back to back, how big is the second trial compared to the first one? Is the second trial identical to the first one? Then it would be 100% of it. Or is it half the intensity of the first one? That would be 50%. And what you're seeing on the x-axis is the distance from the occipital pole in visual cortex. So there you go. If you have trials that are 6 seconds apart, the second trial is just about 80% of the first one. Now put them 1 second apart, and the second trial on average is maybe just about 40% of it. And it looks kind of like a straight line. Distance from the occipital pole doesn't matter. Well, get further away into the fusiform gyrus, and now the story starts being very different, right? And as you go rostral, the effect actually worsens over time. So by the time you're, this far, this 50 millimeters away from the occipital pole, your second event that is 1 second away is getting penalized so much more than your second event that was only 25 millimeters away or 10 millimeters away or something like that. Right? So this is all the ways in which this becomes extremely problematic when you're looking into your data. Now, how do we actually, and given this, how do we tease apart trials? Well, really the secret is to shuffle things around. If you can shuffle things around, then you can at least recover each individual response. It still might suffer from these problems, but at least you can get a reasonable estimate out of it. Right, so the crucial point, in order to at least get something out, even if these effects will still remain, is that you really need to shuffle things as well as you can. Right? As I mentioned, I think in the previous slide set, counterbalancing is what people have used for quite a while, but it requires so many trials that it might be difficult to do. So most people that I see use full or pseudo randomization. One small important note: if you use full randomization, fantastic. Right? You're just randomizing everything for every subject, every run, everything is randomized, great. If you have enough trials, it should work out. But if you can't, let's say that you don't want to show the same stimulus twice back to back, and you start imposing these kind of constraints, so you do a constrained randomization or a pseudo randomization. My suggestion would be to create multiple pseudo randomizations. Right? For example, you might want to create 4 different pseudo randomizations, and then you might want to have some subjects do the first 4 this way, and other subjects do the same 4 randomizations but backwards, starting from the last trial to the first one. Right? You want to get clever in order to avoid discovering after the fact that a third of your subjects all had a certain order which you hadn't noticed, and now there's this big confound that you can't do anything about other than ditching those subjects and acquiring new ones, which is an expensive mistake to make. Right? Another good way of shuffling things around is really to just put randomization or jittering in between trials. Take the hemodynamic response to trials that are 16 seconds apart. This is what you would see, right? You would see each deflection, and then back to baseline, deflection, baseline, etc. Now put them 3 seconds apart. The actual variance that you're getting is just kind of this big increase and then a little squiggly line. So not much variance to tell how much of that big, right, how much goes into trial 1 and how much goes into the following trial 2 that is overlapping. Even worse, if you put stuff 1 second away, you really get this straight line. At this point, you can't tell which part of that line comes from any of your trials, really, and you're stuck. Now, do the exact same things, but just randomize the distance in between your trials. It doesn't matter much for those 16 seconds apart trials, but now you can see that you get all this variance, and this variance is what allows you to tell how much went into each part of that overlapping trial. Right? And it works very well even with 1 second fixation, with 1 second blanks in between. Very simple to do, just insert, right? Create a little jitter and insert it in between your trials. If you really want, you can fish that jitter from an exponential distribution, so that most of your jitters will be really tiny and then 1 or 2 will be pretty big. That works pretty well. Although in terms of power, I haven't seen it do any different from a Gaussian distribution, but it might save you some time. Another way of doing this is to actually insert every now and then a blank event. So task A, then blank, task B, task A right away, blank, task A, B, A, then blank, blank, task B, blank, task B, task A right away. You can sort of, by inserting these blanks in there, you're essentially doing the same as jittering, right? As long as you intersperse them randomly. Pretty much so you end up doing the same effect. So you really gotta do one of these, else your event-related design is not gonna work. Now, sometimes it is impossible to jitter events. You cannot shuffle around events. For example, you cannot shuffle around encoding with recalling. Right? You cannot recall before you've encoded. I mean, if you can, then you've proved precognition, which would win you a Nobel Prize. It'd be great. But short of that, it's tough, right? You're stuck. You always have to present, you will always have disorder happening in all trials. You'll always have your stimulus presented before you respond to it, or before you recall it, or before something. So in this case, a good way of doing is to have the retention interval be a jittered interval. So sort of your two events keep happening, encoding, recall, but the distance between the two keeps jittering. And by the same principle as the one I explained earlier, you will be able to create sort of an average response to the encoding and separate it from an average response to the recall. In fact, Russ Poldrak, I believe this slide here comes from Russ Poldrak. Finally, if you really want, you can mix these designs in clever ways. You can do what is called a nested design. For example, you might have blocks where you have, let's see, these are happy faces, then fearful faces, then happy faces, right? So the type of face you see happens in blocks, although within the blocks they're jittered, right? And then these are interspersed happy and sad faces, fearful faces, and these are interspersed happy and fearful faces. These are interspersed happy and fearful faces. And they are, as you can see here, they're jittered, right? They're randomly jittered. But then in blocks, you're attending to the gender of the face, or you're attending to the emotion. And then you can start looking at interaction. So you can combine these experimental designs to do clever things. Alrighty, good. Now, this was all easy, right? I mean, come on, you must have encountered these things before. What is harder is to actually be confident that what you're doing truly is giving you the max bang for your buck. Look, these experiments, as Russ mentioned a moment ago, very expensive, right? And any mistake here will be a very costly mistake, right? Either to yourself, if you're sort of the one who found the money from some funding source, or to your PI who could not be happy if, right, suddenly you've acquired some $1,000s of data and, oh gosh, my experimental design was bad. We have to restart, which might or might not have happened to the speaker. I know there's somebody watching this remotely who's thinking, yep. In my lab. All right. So what I want to do now before finishing, and we're gonna, if I remember correctly, you're actually gonna see, and you will have a practical about this tomorrow that we're gonna do together, and you will have all the scripts to do this and bring it home with you. But it's going over the idea of efficiency. Now, if you can think of efficiency kind of as a number that captures the relative ability of a design to detect an effect of interest, right? So this is sort of a judgment on how strong the experimental design you've created is. And quite frankly, given that most of you do have MATLAB on some cluster that you have at your own university, and if you don't have MATLAB, Octave works just as well, and it's free. There's no excuse for not looking at this before you ever put anybody in the MRI machine, right? So hopefully tomorrow, as you try this, you'll kind of get a flavor on how to do it, bring home these scripts, and use them to your advantage. Let's put it this way. Let's say that we're interested in the difference in task A, task B, and their difference, right? Something like that. Whatever it may be, faces, houses, algebra, language, something like that. Now, if you think of what your t-test ends up being, is really the estimate of, let's say, the difference between A and B over its variability, right? So that's essentially what you're doing. Now, efficiency is proportional to that. In fact, given a certain contrast, C, and a certain design matrix, the ordering of your events, efficiency is 1 over the variance of what you're looking at, right? This defines efficiency. Now, let me break this down a little bit, right? So if you go through, right, if you use the standard notation for a GLM, you might end up with something like 1 over the estimate of the variance, contrast, transpose your betas. But really what I want to show is this. That was anticlimactic. This, right? So this is the expression, again, if you like GLM, if you like matrices, you might be familiar with this. But here's what's so interesting about this. So the first term is noise, all right? You can't do anything about this, right? So when you're calculating the efficiency of your design, well, noise will be in there. You can't do anything about it. Or rather, you can do something about it, and it's in the pre-processing. It's not in your experimental design. Everything else that is in here is actually something that you can decide before you ever put anybody in the MRI machine. For example, CT is a transpose of your contrast of interest. Who decides the contrasts of interest? XT, all right, X transpose X. What is that? That is the design matrix. Who decides the design matrix? Right. And of course, the last C, you decide that one too. So before you ever put anybody in the MRI machine, you can use efficiency to your advantage to calculate how good your experiment is, right? Or at least, you know, how much bang for your buck you should expect to get out of this one particular experimental design you've created. The reason for this is that when you sit down at your desk and come up with an experimental design, there's so many forks that you could take. And what are you going to base those decisions on? Some things you can decide, psychological factors, right? Those you can decide. But then think, should I randomize, not randomize? Should I block? Should I do event-related designs? How many trials do I need for the event-related design to get something comparable to my block? Do I have that much time to do event-related design? Right? Can I sort of have an experiment that is so long that will have all the events that I need to approximate the power of, or the efficiency rather, of a block design? These are all decisions that you're pretty much doing sitting at your own desk. Probably you've taken these decisions in the past by looking at whatever was done previously in your own lab or previously in the literature that you happen to inhabit, right? And this is terrible. Given how easy it is to look at these things, there's no excuse for not coming up with 3 or 4 different designs and then just put them through the simple scripts that you will get here tomorrow. Very simple to use. Let me give you some examples, sort of how this translates into practice. Let's say our X matrix is, again, task A, task B, the mean, something of that sort. Now, what are my contrasts of interest? So the C matrix, well, direct comparison, so A minus B. And then I really also want to see each task versus its baseline, just to get sort of a view of overall what does it take to see faces and houses. So 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. Right? These together make my contrast matrix. And here are the questions. Should I randomize, not randomize? Event-related or block? Should I use rest periods in between blocks, or can I do away with the rest periods? If I could do away with the rest periods, I can jump back way more trials in there. Right? Again, you're usually sitting at your own desk, pondering or potentially career making. No, it's not true. But over what could be very important factors. Right? So here we go. If you're not familiar with this display, just because the software you use doesn't use exactly this display, on the sort of along the vertical of this display, I'm showing each condition. So condition A, condition B, mean. And the intensity of the bar, if you take those, I usually show this sideways, right? This is sort of what I show. It's the same thing. You have to imagine that the color is sort of the task coming out towards you, right? So for example, red means actually this side is easier. Task on, task off, task on, task off, task on, task off. And in a randomized, of course, maybe here you have many tasks, here you only have one, here you have many back-to-back, here there must be 3 or 4 back-to-back. That's why the intensity is like this. So which of the two should I use? Well, very simple. Let's look at efficiency. The overall efficiency of my fixed design, overall, so given my 3 contrasts, and given the experimental design, which is this on, off, on, off, and the interleaved off, on, off, on. Given this particular experimental design, the efficiency is 0.31. Great. Is that a good efficiency? Well, it's not a number in the sense, it's not a quantitative number, it's a relative number. So you can only tell compared to a different experimental design. By the way, you can also look at individual contrasts. So my 1 minus 1 contrast has an efficiency of 1.35, and my versus baseline contrast have these 2 efficiencies. Well, let's compare that to the numbers I get from my randomized approach. And here we go. Now my overall efficiency is 1.32. Right? You don't do any stats on this. You just really look at the difference, and it's a pretty good difference. What is interesting is that not only my task versus baseline went up, sorry, task A versus task B, but really, what really got boosted now is my task A versus baseline and task B versus baseline. So now you know that actually this design is way better, really across the board. But now, okay, so this is a good design, and I'm keeping down here the numbers you saw a second ago. But how about if I compare that to a block design? Assuming that the psychological processes of interest are amenable to being blocked, how well does this block design work? Right, so, 30 seconds on, break, 30 seconds on, break, 30 seconds on, right, for the two conditions. Well, here we go. Gosh, 4.80 overall efficiency, and really, again, across the board, I'm just getting a massive increase in the efficiency. Right? Of course, you knew that, right? I told you at the very beginning, block design is way better if it fits your cognitive process of interest, which it might or might not. And now, yet another question. Is it the same? So I think up here, oh no, sorry. Can I just do away? Here I had all this waste of time, right? Can I do away with those breaks and just have task A, boom, task B, task A, task B, task A, task B? Somebody has an intuition for that? Well, let's see. I'm sorry? You can't space them? The contrast against baseline dies off. Why? There's no baseline. So if all I cared about were condition A versus condition B, that'd be great. In fact, I've done this in the past. I've just done away with breaks. I just need condition A versus condition B. I don't care about the against baseline. There was some good reasons for doing that. And indeed, if you look at the down here, if you look at the no rest, so the A minus B, they work the same, because overall, you're spending the same amount of time under A and the same amount of time under B. What is changing is the overall length of the run, right? You can see here 160 versus 80. Of course, because I pretty much took out half of the time, which was just wasted staring at a fixation screen. But now I lost completely the ability to do condition A versus baseline and condition B versus baseline. So again, if you don't care about that, then by all means, not only still do 160 volumes, but acquire twice as much of this, right? But see, these are the questions that you can ask yourself without ever going to the MRI machine, without ever spending a single dime on fMRI time, right? Way better than discovering this after the fact. And this works great. What I'm going to show you tomorrow, works great for detecting these kind of things, and also for detecting problems in your design matrix, which I'm going to get back when we talk about the GLM. So let me just sort of bring this together with kind of a good practices summary. Of course, keep in mind, I'm going to say some general remarks. Your specific experiment might have good reasons for differing from what I'm going to say. For one, look, bigger is better. More trials, more TRs, more subjects, right? Better. Always counterbalance, randomize, pseudo-randomize, whatever you can do, right? And then ask yourself many questions. What's the best design for your cognitive process of interest? And this, you're really introspecting, right? You're really thinking over, you're looking at the previous literature. In terms of turning your question into an MRI task, there you're introspecting. But in terms, right, of then designing the actual thing, right? So what's the best design for your task? Here you can do a lot, right? And then once you have different designs in mind, what's the psychological factors that might be at play? If I block this, is it going to work? Is it going to lead to strategies? Is it not going to lead to strategies? Do I need to do a jitter randomized to minimize? Sorry, do I need to have single events in order to prevent mindsets and stuff like that? And of course, what comparisons interest you? And above all, maximize your efficiency, simulate. Go home, spend a little time looking at this, see which approach is best. And then at least you're going into your experiment with, a little more confidence than you would if you never looked at that. And finally, a note on humanity. Be considerate. For how long you think you can keep someone, even your over-caffeinated 20-year-old undergrad, inside an MRI machine and get good data, right? And I think I'll leave it at that. And questions? Or take a breath first, I'll do the same. And then, so let's see if there's any questions coming up. Yeah, yeah, and tomorrow I have to speak for more. Microphone's down there. Can you get it in front here?
The last example, yes. So if you still keep 160 degree of freedom, would your overall efficiency improve or no?
Again, this is a first level. So my degrees of freedom, and again, my degrees of freedom are not about the estimation, but are about the inference. And here, I haven't yet gotten into the inference stage, which is where the degrees of freedom would become particularly relevant. But again, usually, not to say always, but usually, you don't get too touchy about losing degrees of freedom at this stage. You got so many, and it's not where you will do the inference. You know, always better to have as much as possible, but not as big a concern at this level.
But, I mean, so like, let's say if you're removing rest block, right? Would you still suggest scanning 160 versus?
Well, no, I mean, well, here, for the one comparison that I can do, I have exactly the same efficiency, right? So that tells you that at this stage, it's not that big a deal. Because here, the number of TRs during task A and task B are exactly didn't change. The volumes under each condition didn't change. I paid it here and here. Yeah. Give it a second. There you go.
One thing that I guess one could do, and I wonder if you could comment on that, is to have, so imagine you have four conditions, not just two. You can have blocks of condition 1, 2, 3, 4, and then rest.
Sure.
So, which would again give you more space. And I guess what you're asking is, if you do 160 volumes, you're going to get, you're going to get more data out. So that's obviously good. I mean, more is better.
Yeah.
So if you do that,
but it's data that is irrelevant to what I'm doing, so it's actually a waste of time. Right? Well, if you really wanted to keep the 160, I would double up on the task A, B, A, B, A, B, and then do another 80 of A, B, A, B, A, B. Then you're really hammering it.
but do you think there's obviously one could run this optimization thing, but is it better to have? So imagine you have these four conditions, you do 4 blocks, and then you do rest.
Sure.
I imagine you get both things out of it. Possibility of running against baseline, but also more time for your.
Yeah, as opposed to 1 baseline, 2 baseline, 3 baseline. Yeah, absolutely. You can certainly do that. You'd have to run it through this to get the exact number. But I do not see a huge problem with that, as long as everything's counterbalanced and this and that, and you don't get psychological effects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So essentially what you're doing is you're inserting blanks here and there. Yep.
Is it possible to do this type of estimation if you have 2 groups and you expect a different activation in one group for a condition versus another group?
No, because this is completely agnostic to the data. This is purely, you can see it this way. This is just how well am I setting up my design. This doesn't know anything about the differences between groups or real data. This is just, am I setting up for the best possible design? Very important, but. Yeah, back all the way. We need to leave a microphone with you.
I'm sorry.
No, this is great. I couldn't be happier over seeing your questions.
So if we think about group level designs,
Yeah.
They also involve like group A blocks versus group B blocks that you do. So the tools that you are specifying, can it be used then to?
Yeah, so the way I've set it up, for example, and the way in which people usually have used this in the past is on the single subject. I see nothing wrong with coming up with a way that, because it's really the same, right? If you think about it, all that you're doing at the group level, if you're doing the standard two-level hierarchical approach, is that you're going to have an X matrix that specifies patients versus controls, and a contrast that specifies what you're doing about it. Right? So in that sense, you sure can use the same approach. It also is true that usually at that level, all you're doing is A minus B or something of that sort. But you could use the exact same framework to look at something like that. Just currently, it's just set up to look at time series, and it looks at how well you're recovering. If you knew what was the real beta, the real parameter, it really tells you how well you're going to recover it. You can think of it that way. If you did, 1,000 simulations with noise. But yeah. Alrighty.
Give this guy a pass. Recover his voice.
Yeah, before we start talking about the GLM.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's it for today. Am I right?
I think it is, yes.
Very good. Thanks everybody for being here. We'll start tomorrow morning. Lectures will start at 9. And you guys should settle in a bit. And what else do I have to tell you? I have a quick question. I have the opportunity, if people are starting to feel very peckish in the afternoon, of putting some light snacks in back. Are people feeling like they cannot survive without that, or I should try, or any feedback with that? Who would like